This video is sponsored by you, the viewers, and the members at our Patreon. Sign up to the Patreon if you'd like to support the channel. Link in the description. In 1962, Japan had secured her place in the sun as the sole but not unchallenged hegemon of Asia. However, the state of affairs had not always been the case, nor was it a certainty. Once upon a time, it seemed inconceivable that the Japanese Empire would amount to anything in the world other than a tributary of China. One would have to go back 100 years to understand just how things had turned out this way. In 1853, under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate, the island nation of Japan maintained 300 years of isolationism. However, Japan's isolationism would end when on July 14, 1853, the American expedition of Matthew Perry forced the Japanese to open up their markets with the threat of modern gunboats. Japan, unwilling to go to war with the Western power, relented and signed the Convention of Kanagawa, effectively opening up her markets to the Western world. Japan's acquiescence to Western demands was heavily influenced by the outcomes of the Opium Wars, which had seen the hegemon of Asia, the Qing Empire, humiliated by the British and French empires with unequal treaties. To avoid a similar fate, Japan avoided war with the West at all costs and quickly underwent several decades of brutal modernization. Japan's attempted modernization saw the country fall into multiple civil wars. First, to dissolve the shogunate in place of an empowered emperor, then to eliminate the samurai class. From the ashes of civil war came a new Japan, with a modernized army, Western-inspired parliamentary system, and a capitalist economy, the common features of a great power at the time. This was in stark contrast to the Qing Empire, which had failed to commit to the smallest of reforms and had been forced to accept several rounds of unequal treaties. While the Qing Empire fell into rebellion and stagnation, the Japanese Empire had begun laying the groundwork for her own Asian hegemony. It first challenged China's dominance over Asia during the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894, which saw the Qing army and navy completely humiliated by Japan's. The Korean peninsula and Taiwan too fell into Japan's orbit. This brought Tokyo into conflict with Russia's sphere of influence, eventually exploding into the Russo-Japanese War. It was in this conflict where Japan had surprised the world with its victory over Russia. The news of Japan's victory was of special interest to the colonized peoples of Asia, who began to see Japan, not China, as the new leader of a pan-Asian struggle. The Pan-Asian movement was a continent-wide political movement in Asia with the stated goal of driving out European imperialism. The movement often overlapped with nationalist movements which existed across Europe's Asian colonies. When Japan defeated Russia in 1905, many revolutionaries around Asia began flocking to Japan in hopes of securing financial and military support. While Japan's civilian government remained mostly aloof to the Pan-Asianists, nationalist secret societies began flirting with a wider movement to lay the groundworks for their own vision of a Japanese hegemony. While Japan enjoyed the fruits of her imperial success with the acquisition of Tsingtao and the Micronesian islands from the German Empire after the First World War, trouble began to brew into the late 1920s. Social instability hit Japan particularly hard following decades of post-war economic boom. The Showa financial crisis of 1927 and the Great Depression in 1929 resulted in the foreclosure of banks and businesses across the nation, the increase in prices of basic goods, and a rise in unemployment. Japan's industrialization over the decades also saw the development of a Japanese labor movement. By the 1920s, the labor movement had become active among the nation's industrial working class. In response to deteriorating social conditions, trade unions organized strikes in hopes of securing fairer wages. Militant trade unionism threatened the position of modern Japan's ruling elites, the landlords, the aristocrats, the bourgeoisie, and the zaibatsus. The economic elites of Japan, who had once ruled over the country with very little opposition, now saw their power threatened by the lower classes. In an attempt to stave off the coming class conflict, the elites began flirting with a new ideological movement that had sprung up in the late 1890s, that of Japanese nationalism. Ever since the Meiji Restoration, Japan had adopted a British-inspired form of constitutional monarchy. During the Meiji and Taisho eras, this form of government was sufficient enough to maintain the oligarchy's rule over Japan. Over time, a push was made by reformist politicians to open up the political system to the people by implementing universal male suffrage. While nominally more democratic, the oligarchs still held sufficient control over the political system through their dominance of the political parties, but their rule would be put into question when the political establishment failed to respond timely to the crisis of the 1920s. Meanwhile, Japanese cultural nationalists, many educated in Europe, had returned to Japan with new concepts of defining the Japanese nation. Many of them were highly critical of the liberalism dominant during the Taisho era, referring to them as foreign ideas incompatible with Japan. The cultural nationalists argued that Japan had to find their own national spirit, which they found in the Kokutai. The Kokutai itself can be translated as national political essence, often referring to the myth of Japan's unbroken line of emperors and to the customs and traditions of Japan. But the vagueness of this definition could be more easily understood in how the concept is used in its application. Kokutai was used as a rationale for the Meiji Restoration, and over the course of the Taisho era, it was used as ideological justification for harsh crackdowns on all opposition, most notably the socialists. This was most exemplified when in 1925, the Japanese government passed the Peace Preservation Law, which had the stated goal of suppressing socialists and communists. The law itself made it illegal for citizens to criticize Japan's system of private property, or to propose an altering of the Kokutai itself. Under this nativist conception of government, people were no longer seen as equals under the law, but rather as children of the family state, exemplified by their father, the emperor, and his cabinet. Issues in society, whether political or economic, had to be resolved through harmonious acceptance of authority rather than debate or class conflict, while systemic problems such as poverty were viewed as necessary and inevitable but regrettable facets of society, and any form of opposition to the national spirit, no matter the size, was seen as treason against the nation. These ideas were popular amongst the young officer corps, who began viewing the civilian government in Tokyo with much distrust. Across the empire, unaccountable officers began making moves independent of any proper chain of command, the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 being the most infamous cases in the interwar period. Civilian loss of control over the army would spiral Japanese politics even further. Secret societies of Japanese nationalists launched multiple waves of assassinations against their enemies, including several ministers and prime ministers, as well as a failed coup attempt in early 1936. The final nail in the coffin came when a military incident known as the Marco Polo Bridge incident occurred near Beijing. The incident would plunge the Japanese Empire into their most deadly war yet, the Second Sino-Japanese War. In 1940, under the premiership of Prince Fumimaro Konoe, the political parties of Japan were to be reorganized and subsumed into Japan's one and only legal political organization, the Imperial Rule Assistance Association. Under the Assistance Association's rule, large swaths of Japanese society were mobilized for the war effort, first against China, then against the Allied powers. It was the first pillar of Japanese fascism to be entrenched into the political system, but it won't be the last. When the Japanese Empire came to blows with the European powers in 1940 with the occupation of Indochina, and later in 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the invasion of the Philippines, Burma, and Netherlands India, Japan required a political force legitimate enough to assist them in the ruling of the Asia Pacific. For this task, Tokyo hosted the Greater East Asia Conference in 1943, together with other Asian representatives. These representatives included Bao Mao from Burma, Jiang Jingwei and Wang Jingwei from China, Wan Waitayakan from Thailand, Jose P. Laurel from the Philippines, and Subhas Chandra Bose from India. The stated goal was quite simple. Japan had always argued that its imperial ambitions were unlike that of the Europeans. While Europe conquered Asia in the name of imperialism, market expansion, and the civilizing mission, Japan's conquests were all under the name of Pan-Asianism, and that Japan's aggression in Asia was to free Asia from colonial bondage. The farce could not be made any clearer. Japan's war situation, specifically in China, had grown quite dire when the Netherlands, Britain, and America embargoed Japan following the occupation of Indochina. Japan required the resources in Asia to continue their war effort, and thus political decisions were made with economic consideration. The Pan-Asian movement proved to be a useful tool for the Japanese in making sure that their control over Asia was as stable as can be. It begs the question, had the countries of Asia not been as crucial to Tokyo's industries, would they have made it into Japan's political calculus? That is not to say that the co-prosperity sphere was a one-way road straight to Tokyo, far from it. Since the 1920s, nationalists in Asia had been agitating for more rights from the European colonial governments. These nationalists often faced brutal repression by the colonial governments of the Allied powers, exemplified in the cases of the Dutch East Indies, the British Raj, and the Philippines. Nationalist associations had been banned in many cases, with their leaders often driven underground, exiled, or imprisoned under harsh conditions. It is then not too surprising that the nationalists of Asia found themselves drifting towards Tokyo's orbit, seeing collaboration as a necessary evil to free their peoples from Europe's grip. All this, of course, was a useful cloak for the Japanese Empire's true ambition of becoming hegemon of Asia. With collaboration governments across Asia, Japan found herself flooded with much-needed resources and manpower. To manage the logistics, a system of brutal corvée labor was implemented across Asia with the rubber stamping of local leaders. With resources flowing, Tokyo was able to fight Washington on equal footing. The Japanese and the United States had by 1942 been engaged in a war in the Pacific, with the Micronesian islands becoming the main battlefield of the war. But by 1945, the Allied powers would be battered and beaten in Europe by the combined armies of Germany and Italy. Seeing the situation in Europe, Washington could not hope to salvage the situation in Asia. The defeat of the Allies would be cemented when Japan dropped the atomic bomb on Pearl Harbor, putting an end to the Second World War. The now victorious Empire of Japan set to work in establishing a new international order in East Asia. Using the foundations of the Greater East Asia Conference of 1943, the newly formed countries of Indonesia, Laos, Kampuchea, Vietnam, and Guangdong would be formally invited into the co-prosperity sphere. But East Asia was not naive. It was understood that their independence was owed to Japan, and that Japan was above them in the alliance. Japan made such a thing clear through the use of economic coercion in influencing the internal politics of her allies. While Japanese advisors assisted in the creation of the new Asian countries' constitutions, they made sure to weigh into decisions where they saw fit, and while such a position was unfavorable for the countries of the newly independent Asian countries, they understood that they had little choice but to obey. And so Asia marched onwards from the 1940s into the 50s and 60s as Japan's very own sphere of influence. 2 decades under the co-prosperity sphere's umbrella had brought closer economic ties and an increased level of development across the Asia-Pacific. But this was at the cost of a problematic economic dependency with Tokyo, and worsening social conditions for the peoples of Asia. And while Japan's newly found hegemony seemed airtight from the outside, troubles would begin to brew from within the co-prosperity sphere. Trouble which her adversaries in Germania and Washington seemed poised to exploit for their own geopolitical gains. Whether or not Tokyo could weather the coming storm, nobody knew, but it was understood that Tokyo would use any means necessary, including force, to maintain harmony in East Asia. For 20 years, the Japanese Empire ruled Asia alone as the uninterrupted and sole hegemon of the Eastern Hemisphere. She had established total political and economic dominance over all other sovereign polities in the region through the use of the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Utilizing this international institution, Japan had managed to construct a region-wide political economy that solely relied on capital flowing from Tokyo and into the uneven development of the Asian periphery. The resource-rich and populous Asian periphery was the perfect material basis that Japan needed to transform her political hegemony over Asia into economic dominance over the world. Greater Asia's productive capabilities combined with Japan's communications technology innovation had turned Japan's sphere into something of a global exporter of new kinds of goods, which flowed into the global markets. Within the co-prosperity sphere lay some of the world's largest producers of textiles, steel, food produce, automobiles, and everyday electronics. Not only was the co-prosperity sphere able to produce all these with resources within their own sphere, they also had the manpower to feed into the industrial economy. Such was the behemoth of Greater Asia, which Washington and Germania observed with much fear and contempt. At the end of the Second World War, the three world superpowers, Germany, Japan, and America, had been engaged in a three-way global Cold War with one another. While they had each established dominance over their own respective hemispheres, a tension existed amongst the great powers. In more primitive times, these tensions would boil over into a total war between rivaling powers, but such was not applicable in the age of nuclear weapons. Germany had been the first to develop the atomic bomb during the Pacific War, with Japan and America quickly acquiring them soon after. By the 1960s, each global superpower had tens of thousands of nuclear warheads at their disposal. The largest of these stockpiles belonged to the Reich, with 20.1 thousand warheads, followed by the United States at 12.3 thousand, and finally the Rising Sun at 8.1 thousand. The nuclear arms race had done one thing that no peace treaty nor alliance could do. It had ended a millennia of great power wars which once dominated the history of mankind. Direct conflict with their adversaries was unthinkable for Washington, Germania, and Tokyo. The threat of mutually assured destruction from total nuclear war was to be avoided at all costs. After all, what good is a continental-wide empire if the world was covered in ashes? In place of direct wars between the great powers came the Cold War, the new normal of great power conflict in the nuclear age. Of course, each great power had their own goal and tactics in the Cold War. This was to be expected, as Japan, Germany, and the United States had their own unique circumstances. The United States' Cold War strategy revolved around their diminished global position and their defeat in the Second World War. They thus adopted the rollback doctrine, a strategy which focused on beating back the tide of fascism, one link at a time. Meanwhile, Germania's strategists viewed the Cold War around maintaining Germany's existing conquests. It is no secret that Germany's hold over Europe is fragile and their leadership erratic, exemplified by the Italo-German split of the 1950s. Japan's goal in the Cold War, however, is not all too dissimilar to Germany's. A young empire by all metrics, Japan's hegemony over Asia was not airtight. The Cold War for Japan was a constant struggle to maintain sole supremacy over the East Asian international order, while also expanding her market reach across the world. This meant driving out what competitors existed, whether from outside Asia or from within. Since the end of the Second World War, the military governorate of Shonan Marai had ruled the territories of Malaya and Singapore tightly. The governorate was tasked with building the foundations of a proper Malayan state, which would then be integrated into the co-prosperity sphere system. But the region proved particularly resilient towards Tokyo's overtures. Under the leadership of Chen Peng, the United Malayan Anti-Japanese Front mounted an effective high-intensity military resistance against Shonan Marai. The resistance would gain newly found strength when assistance from Washington found its way into the hands of the UMAJF. But this newly found assistance would ultimately not help with the anti-Japanese front. The unpopular Prime Minister of Japan, Inno Hiroya, reeling from a diplomatic defeat at the hands of Richard Nixon in the Aleutian crisis, had decided another defeat was unconscionable. More resources had to be pulled into resolving the Malayan emergency. The Shonan Marai garrison was increased in size and funding, while the Air Force assisted with a renewed bombing campaign. The UMAJF was no match for the IJA's renewed offensive. The insurgents were driven back north until they had nowhere else to run. Malaya had finally been secured 2 weeks into 1962. Inno's gamble had succeeded in saving his cabinet, for now. On March 21, 1963, the Japanese stock market crashed following the uncovering of a large corruption scheme involving the Yasuda Zaibatsu. The Zaibatsu had manipulated investors into funding large drilling operations in Manchuria. The certainty of profits which came from oil drilling operations in general had enticed many venture capitalists to invest into the stocks in high volumes. In reality, the stocks were not invested into oil drilling operations, but rather into logistical operations of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy for transporting non-existent goods. The officers partaking in the operation would pocket the profits for themselves. The severity of the corruption had reached a point that high-level officials were implicated. The resulting stock market crash would grind the entire co-prosperity sphere to a screeching halt, as corporations across the Japanese economy lost 50% of their value, and millions of workers suffered layoffs. Greater Asia's sudden economic crash created a much-needed opening for Japan's Pacific adversary in the United States. The American failure to re-enter the Pacific during the Malayan emergency proved a strategic blow to Richard Nixon's foreign policy doctrine. To counteract their strategic setback, State Secretary Robert McNamara advised the US President on a plan to break the co-prosperity sphere, starting with the Philippines. The Pearl of the Orient had been an independent republic aligned with Tokyo since the end of the Second World War. President Yulo ruled this Second Philippine Republic from his capital in Manila, but his authority over the entire archipelago was severely limited. Large swaths of territory had fallen under control of anti-Japanese partisans. Two large groups defined the anti-Japanese partisan struggle in the Philippines: the Communists in the north and the Free Republic of the South. For decades, President Yulo failed to suppress the two insurgencies, allowing them to roam freely in the countryside and establishing their own de facto independent rule over the north and the south. This was the opportunity which US State Secretary McNamara wished to exploit. On March 31, 1963, the All-Filipino Revolutionary Socialist Republic and the Free Philippine Republic launched a joint anti-Laurelist offensive, or JALO, with the support of the United States. It was hoped that the combined forces of the communist guerrillas and the Free Philippine partisans would be enough to overwhelm the government in Manila and break Japan's hold over the archipelago. The guerrillas made their way out of their bases and into Laurelist territory. To assist with the invasion, the Free Philippine Army received American guns and military advisors. The Second Republic's armies buckled under pressure from the two-front war, while Tokyo, still embroiled in the post-Yasuda crisis corruption scandal, failed to offer much assistance. For now, President Yulo would have to fend for himself. To everyone's surprise, a month into the war, the Second Philippine Republic would still find itself holding against the JALO. President Yulo's armies had managed to turn the war into a stalemate as the guerrillas failed to break through the strings of government-controlled towns. This renewed Tokyo's confidence with the Second Republic's government. Now, Manila's calls for assistance began to be heard by the decision-makers in Prime Minister Ino's cabinet. Japanese reinforcements started flowing into the Philippines in support of the Yulo government. These reinforcements were what the Second Philippine Republic needed to break the stalemate. Yulo's troops began making plans for a northern encirclement campaign against the Communists. By mid-April, the Communists would be routed in face of Manila and Tokyo's renewed offensive. With the northern front secured, the Second Philippine Republic turned their attention southwards towards the American-backed Free Philippine Republic. Direct American support had turned the soldiers of the Free Army into formidable opponents on the battlefield. But American military advisors were not enough to stop Manila and Tokyo's joint offensive. The United States held a huge disadvantage in fighting this war, namely the difficulties of logistics. Their closest Pacific base being in Australia, aid in any sort required large amounts of preparation. In comparison, the Empire of Japan benefited largely from having military bases close to the battlefields. And thus, when Tokyo's allies launched their final southern offensive, the Free Army would not hold. By the 28th of May, 1963, the Free Army surrendered their arms to Manila, and soon following, President Jose Yulo announced the reunification of the Philippines. However, the reunification of the Philippines would be the high point of President Yulo's presidency. A week after the announcement, the president would find himself in an assassination attempt, one which would eventually lead to his death. An interregnum would ensue within the Republic's ruling Kalibapi party, which would be won by the former financier, Assemblyman Sergio Osmeña Jr. The victory of this reform-minded financier in the power struggle would eventually ripple out into the greater co-prosperity sphere, displacing the nationalist and corporatist elements in favor of a new wave of bureaucratic developmentalist style of governing, but little knew how fast the tide would spread. Victories in the Philippines, while decisive, would do little to save Ino's sinking cabinet. Soon after the victory, Prime Minister Ino and his cabinet resigned en masse, his tenure as head of government tainted by his complicity in the Yasuda debacle. His resignation would finally bring down the domination of the conservatives within the Yokusan, shorthand for the Taisei Yokusankai, or Imperial Rule Assistance Association. In place of the conservatives came several factions vying for power, all with their own goals and visions for a strong Japan. Ever since the emergency days of the war in the 1940s, the Yokusan had ruled Japan under a one-party system. Once used as a means of mobilizing the entire nation for war, the Yokusan's monopoly over political power persisted after the war's end. Political monopoly proved a useful tool for the Japanese elite, the oligarchs, the zaibatsus, the princes, and the military men who dominated Japan's political system. But the Yokusan's forced consolidation of a large numbers of peoples who in actuality disagreed heavily with one another in policy and direction proved ripe for factionalism. Factionalism which the technocrats would exploit. The emergency elections which followed Prime Minister Ino's fall would be won by Kaya Okinori, former finance minister and leader of the Yokusan's technocratic factions. The election of the technocrats had signaled a shift in the political winds of Japanese politics. Once dominated by the old, careful, orthodox elites of the Yokusan conservatives, the rise of technocrats was the start of Japan's turn towards an apolitical form of bureaucratic developmentalism. The shift from an ideological corporatism towards an apolitical developmentalism is not totally unfounded. Japan had experienced major socio-economic growth since the war's end. Feudalism had practically been ended by the endless amounts of capital extracted from the Asian periphery, and the social revolutionary conditions which once brought about the rise of the corporatists in the 1930s no longer existed. Having lost their historical mandate, the corporatists saw their usefulness to Japanese political life severely diminished, and thus the technocrats, made up of the nation's ambitious apparatchiks and army officers, rose in prominence. Kaya's technocrats' experience in managing the economic modernizations of the 50s and 60s, and their slavish devotion to constant growth made them a suitable candidate for Japan's historical moment post-Yasuda crisis. And so while the old educated elites found themselves bending over backwards for an ossified establishment, the technocrats came in, promising to sweep the mess and radically reshape Japan in the process along the lines of the profit motive, the start of the Japanese thermidor. The political reverberations of the Yasuda crisis did not limit itself to the sphere's core. All across the many polities of Greater Asia, the post-war political order would be shaken to its foundation, namely in the countries of Kampuchea, Malaya, and Guangdong. In the Southeast Asian Republic of Kampuchea, political troubles had already erupted a year earlier. The republic was ruled by President Son Ngoc-san and his famed Prime Minister, Ie Ka. The Prime Minister had been in charge since 1949 and is considered by many to be the true architect behind the republic. A large portion of his reign had focused on the sole issue of land reform, an issue that plagues the nation's countryside, but the Prime Minister had enemies who sprung into action in July of 1962. The assassination of Ie Ka and the ascendancy of a fragile government led by Prime Minister Achar Sok would not save Kampuchea's troubles. Tired of Achar Sok's ineffective socialist government, President San would declare martial law on July 1, 1963, dismissing parliament in the process. To ensure government unity, President San appointed his loyalist Pat Chun as Prime Minister. The political shakeup, while dramatic, does not change Kampuchea's loyalties towards the co-prosperity sphere. Tokyo issued no diplomatic protest to the incident, while Washington lacked the diplomatic presence to influence the outcome. For now, Kampuchea would be ruled under a new civilian dictatorship. Meanwhile, to the south, the newly formed Malayan state had formed a legitimate pro-Japanese government 1 year after the Malayan emergency. Under the rule of Dato' On Jafar, collaboration between Malaya and Japan occurred uninterrupted.
However, the old statesman would not live long to see his state, dying a year after the formation of his new government. Jafar's party, Hermas, would devolve into infighting following the loss of their leader. In the ensuing power struggle, ardent Malayan nationalist and Japanese collaborator Syed Jafar al-Bar would be catapulted into power, entrenching Tokyo's hold over the Strait of Malacca to the chagrin of Washington. The political shakeups of the post-Yasuda crisis would not limit itself to Greater Asia's periphery. Soon, the fallout would hit several cores of the co-prosperity sphere, namely, the hyper-capitalist experiment of the Pearl Delta, the state of Guangdong. The state of Guangdong was formed at the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War by Hideki Tojo's government. Tokyo initially designed the state to accommodate the war veterans as a form of payment for their patriotic duty. The creation of the state was unpopular in China, but Wang Jingwei's collaborationist government held little sway over the matter. The state of Guangdong would be formed whether he liked it or not. Encompassing the Guangdong province, the state's power centered around the city of Koshu, which sits at the mouth of the Pearl Delta. The province is home to fertile lands in the north, but agricultural activity remained largely ignored by state authorities. Governance within the state nominally falls in the hands of the Guangdong military administration and the chief executive, but its authority is checked by the true powers of Guangdong, the four companies. Politics in Guangdong revolve around the financial conglomerate Yasuda and the three consumer electronic firms Matsushita, Sony, and Fujitsu, who rule the state through their influence in the Silicon Delta's Legislative Council. The three electronic giants exploit their dominance over the Legislative Council to expand the operations and profitability of their firms. The lack of any sorts of worker protection and the Chinese population's status as de facto second citizens within the state offers the three firms the base to produce while cutting on the costs of wages. This significantly strengthened the competitiveness of the three firms' products in the world market at the expense of the workers' living standards. The poor treatment of the largely Chinese working class in Guangdong is exacerbated by the development of large urban slums, where most of the industrial working class live in. The condition of the Chinese working class is starkly contrasted by the Japanese districts, which are modern and luxurious in comparison. The fragile order of the state of Guangdong is held tightly by the chief executive, Suzuki, a strict military man and a check on the powers of the corporations. When the Yasuda crisis hits Guangdong in 1963, and the Yasuda financial conglomerate's power was greatly diminished, the balance of power between the four major firms broke. The major firms worked towards ousting Suzuki from his position, which succeeded on June 30th, 1963. But the fall of Suzuki only exacerbated the conflict between Matsushita, Sony, and Fujitsu, who were now engaged in a corporate war for the position of chief executive. The post-Yasuda crisis would end with the victory of Fujitsu and the rise of the technocratic and meritocratic chief Ibuku Masaru. While Greater Asia experienced great political and economic upheavals in the early 1960s, her Cold War adversaries experienced troubles of their own. The German Reich's political establishment suffered a total collapse after the death of Reichsfuhrer Adolf Hitler. The ensuing struggle for power plunged the Reich into a four-way civil war. When the dust settled, Albert Speer would come out on top on January 16, 1964. But the Reich's inability to settle a succession through peaceful means would expose her frontiers to Washington's plots. A political crisis in the Union of South Africa had developed into a diplomatic standoff between the OFN and the African RCs. The RCs faced off the US-led OFN coalition, who were determined to see Africa free from German rule. Washington hoped to exploit Germany's civil war to finish off the RCs, but the OFN's poor military performance and the RC's determined defense dashed these hopes. Before the OFN could defeat the German armies, Albert Speer announced his support of the German colonies. The stalemate turned into a rout for the Americans, who could no longer manage such an expensive war. At home, US President Richard Nixon faced major backlash from his own people, who were tired of expensive imperialist wars. The loss of the South African War and a political scandal involving wiretapping was the final nail in the coffin for the president, who resigned in shame. Washington had failed yet again to make an opening in the Old World. The Cold War was in full swing. By 1964, peace had once more been restored in Greater Asia. The Japanese Empire had stabilized her imperial sphere's political cohesion after the fallout of the Yasuda crisis. This was mostly thanks to the legacy of the Ino cabinet's foreign policy. Now that the Kaya cabinet was in charge of Japan and the co-prosperity sphere as a whole, it was tasked with managing the entirety of Greater Asia. The second half of 1964 would prove to be a challenging year for the ambitious Kaya cabinet, with developments in South Asia. On July 2, 1964, the South Asian Economic Union Conference between New Delhi and Kolkata began. The conference was hosted on the initiative of the two rival governments of India, the New Delhi-based Republic of India under Prime Minister V.K. Krishna Menon and the Kolkata-based Azad Hind government under Subhash Chandra Bose. The two leaders of India hoped that through the conference, the Indian nation could once more be unified under one state. This would prove a difficult task. The civil war which fractured India was one born out of the personal feuds of India's leaders. 20 years prior, the Indian nation had gained independence from the British Empire when the Indian National Congress announced their separation from London. Upon achieving independence, Jawaharlal Nehru's Indian National Congress formed a joint united government with the Azad Hind movement of Subhash Chandra Bose. The two factions ruled India as one until a diplomatic incident between India and Afghanistan triggered into a full-blown war in South Asia. The ensuing war lasted 2 years, eventually ending with India's defeat in 1949. Out of the gained territories, Afghanistan would form the Northwest Frontier Province and the Union of Balak States. India's political establishment fractured from the fallout of the war. Someone had to be blamed for the defeat, and the INC deemed Chandra Bose a perfect candidate for a scapegoat. But unwilling to accept this fate, Bose fled to Kolkata to announce the creation of a new Indian government, ruled by his Hindustan Samyavadi Sangha or Indian Egalitarian Union. The two Indian states slowly drifted under the vastly different styles of leadership of Bose and Nehru. Bose's Azad Hind, no longer shackled by the INC's pragmatism, underwent a campaign of aggressive land reform in an attempt to root out the caste system and its entrenched aristocracy. Bose did this through a monopolization of political power through the creation of a one-party state. As a result, political power remained solely with the HSS, the peasants and workers of Azad Hind living more prosperously than their counterparts across the border. In comparison, New Delhi remained a multi-party democracy, but offered little in the form of land reform to combat casteism. The noble aristocracy, the landlords, and the zamindars all remained important power brokers in the Republic of India. The importance of local rulers in the Indian democratic system meant that the economic interests of these backwards forces became a key interest group to be catered to during election campaigns. But despite just how different the two Indian states had become, the leadership of both states still wished that one day the two Indias would come together as one. Almost 2 decades after Bose's secession, steps were made by both governments to reconcile and reunify the Indian nation. These efforts culminating into the South Asian Economic Union Conference in July 1964. The world watched in bated breath as negotiators from New Delhi and Kolkata met in Lucknow to discuss the terms of this economic union. But 3 weeks into the negotiations, it would suddenly turn south when on the 28th of July 1964, Subhash Chandra Bose was assassinated by unknown assailants, derailing the peace negotiations. Bose's sudden incapacitation would whip the people of Azad Hind into a patriotic frenzy, claiming foul play by the INC. The entire world watched on, as war between Kolkata and New Delhi seemed inevitable. The Azad Hind Indian National Army immediately mobilized their forces to the border with the Republic of India, who soon also mobilized their armies. To ensure their victory, both governments called on their superpower benefactors for assistance in the war for Indian unification. The newly appointed president of Azad Hind, Nedyam Raghavan, began making calls to Tokyo for military cooperation. These calls were reciprocated by Prime Minister Kaya's government, who deemed Azad Hind's position in the co-prosperity sphere too crucial to be left up to chance. The Imperial Japanese Air Force would assist Kolkata in the event of war. Japan's willingness to participate in the war effort eased the martially inexperienced President Raghavan. The Azad Hind president was an espoused technocrat, not a military man, leading a faction of Pan-Asian technocratic developmentalists
within the HSS,
not too dissimilar to Kaya's style of governance. His rise to power within the Azad Hind was perhaps another ripple in the wave of apolitical technocratic developmentalists within the Greater Asian region. The war for Indian reunification would erupt on the 20th of April, 1965. Troops from both sides would clash along the militarized border region. Republican forces entrenched themselves in the face of Azad Hind's offensive. The Indian National Army pushed hard against the front lines, with assistance from the Japanese Air Force. The sustained air campaign had managed to disrupt key supply hubs of the Republican Army. In response, the Republic entrenched its troops to stave off the Azad Hind advance. After all, the New Delhi government had the numerical advantage over Kolkata, and so Azad Hind would stall in the front lines, failing to make much progress by May. On June 19, 1965, a new front would be opened in the war for Indian unification. The German-backed Dominion of Pakistan, sensing weakness from the Republic of India, declared war on the New Delhi government. Their sudden entry broke the Bengali deadlock as it forced the Republic to reposition troops to the west. This was the development Kolkata needed. Elite formations of the Indian National Army began new pincer movements against the Republic's defenses. The defenses cracked under the overwhelming force. Suddenly, Republican troops were on the rout, surrendering most of eastern India to Kolkata by July. National Army troops continued to sweep across India, launching a northern offensive immediately after consolidating control over the east. By September, New Delhi would fall to the Indian National Army. On the 17th of September, 1965, Prime Minister Shastri of the Republic of India formally surrendered the nation to the victorious Azad Hind government. The Indian subcontinent had been fully secured by the co-prosperity sphere to the annoyance of Washington, who looked onwards as Asia shifted ever closer to total Japanese rule. But Greater Asia's troubles in the mid-1960s were not over just yet, for in the Southeast Asian country of Indonesia, a brutal civil war was about to erupt. Indonesia had been an independent member of the co-prosperity sphere since the end of the Second World War. Led by President Sukarno, the country sits at a strategic position in the Pacific region. It is both resource-rich and populous, making it an incredibly crucial part of Greater Asia's economy. But its size also comes with drawbacks. The territories under the state's sovereignty are discontinuous, separated by sea. To hold itself together, the country's tens of thousands of islands are loosely bound to Jakarta out of loyalty to the National Republic and their shared history under Dutch rule. Power within the Republic itself emanates from the island of Java, the most populous and politically influential island of them all. Java's political ascendancy gives it economic privilege over the other islands, resulting in a country with uneven development. 2 decades of these state of affairs have done little to ingratiate Jakarta in the eyes of the regional leaders. Sukarno's style of governing had also failed to address the growing disparities between Java and the other islands. The Indonesian president is known to have a particular way of governing the nation. He styles himself an enlightened republican in tune with the spirit of the nation. In the view of President Sukarno, Sukarno is Indonesia and Indonesia is Sukarno. In practice, this manifests itself in a top-down management of the country through the use of regional military commands as a method of implementing government policy, whether social, economic, or defense. The transformation of the military into Sukarno's personal daimyo caste has done much to worsen the social inequality rampant in the islands. The military's entry into the landed aristocracy further fueling fire to the flame. Sukarno's Indonesia was held up by a fragile order, ready to collapse at the smallest disturbance. Disturbance came on the 19th of December 1964, when the ever-ambitious Indonesian president launched a bid to tie in his control over the country by declaring martial law. Opposition to his rule had become too much to bear for the president, and the limited powers offered to him by the constitution had restrained Sukarno from totally securing his position. Through the powers vested in him by martial law, President Sukarno began launching attacks against his potential political opponents, most notably the disaffected regional governors. Sukarno's attack on provincial autonomy angered many within the regional elite. An organized resistance began to brew within the outer islands, resistance which Washington was all too eager to support. The political unrest would reach a fever pitch when on March 15, 1965, the disparate regional opposition formed a united front, the Front Indonesia Merdeka, or the Free Indonesian Front. Under the leadership of former Vice President Muhammad Hatta, the FIF declared an insurrection against Jakarta. The American armed militiamen of the FIF began making moves all across the country. Meanwhile, Tokyo observed these developments with much concern. The first phase of the civil war saw troops loyal to Sukarno battle with the FIF, first in Java, then in Sumatra. Sukarno's troops made quick work of the FIF-aligned militias in Java. Meanwhile, by October 1965, the armies loyal to the FIF managed to secure most of Sumatra, the Moluccas, and New Guinea out of Sukarno's hands. With both sides securing their own islands for themselves, a new stalemate would emerge by August 1965. Neither side had the capacity to break the other with an amphibious assault, and military aid from Tokyo and Washington did little to tip the scales. The stalemate continued to last well into November 1965, to the displeasure of everyone. It was hoped, at least by the rebels, that the civil war would be a swift affair to renegotiate the terms of regional autonomy with Jakarta. But Sukarno's unwillingness to negotiate with the rebels dashed the possibility of a quick end to the war. The president's stubbornness annoyed the military generals on both sides, and soon, a plot to overthrow Sukarno and put an end to the war began to circulate in the streets. The rumors spurred the left wing of Sukarno's governing coalition, the armed branch being the Presidential Guards, to spring into action. The Presidential Guard staged a preventive coup, targeting generals implicated with a plot to overthrow Sukarno, with the hopes of dashing the threat to the president. But the Guards' voluntarism had doomed the president they wished to protect. Suddenly, mass protests erupted within Sukarnoist-held territory, demanding the resignation of Sukarno and an immediate end to the civil war. These protests sprung up not 2 days after the kidnapping and murders of the suspected putschist generals, which caught the entire government off guard. Tokyo had her hands in the scales with these events. The Japanese embassy in Jakarta had monitored the deteriorating situation closely and developed a course of action if a coup were to be attempted. It was hoped that through the formation of a clear plan, Tokyo could steer events in her favor. In the end, the elimination of the ambitious generals by Sukarno's Presidential Guards played into the hands of Tokyo and to their newly appointed proxy in the country, General Suharto. Suharto had helped spur on the anti-Sukarnoist protests through the dissemination of leaflets, radio messages, and posters which students were all too eager to support. In face of all this resistance from within his perceived camp, the Indonesian president resigned from his position on November 26, 1965, handing over power to Suharto. In the Free Indonesian Front, Muhammad Hatta too was urged by his general, Zulkifli Lubis, to resign in favor of the general. Upon ascending to the FIF presidency, Lubis announced the dissolution of the front and his support for the new Suharto regime in Jakarta, ending the civil war in one fell swoop. Tokyo cabled their support for the new regime in Jakarta, sending delegates to meet with Indonesia's new managerial shogun. By New Year's Eve 1966, Japanese Prime Minister Kaya had overseen the strengthening of the Greater Asian family, with the crushing of opposition in Malaya, Indonesia, Kampuchea, and Guangdong, and the reunification of the Philippines and Hindustan. The co-prosperity sphere had survived Washington and Germania's attempt to attack the harmony of Asia's international society. With the securing of Asia, Tokyo could now look beyond the Orient to expand her reach towards farther lands. There was much potential for the Japanese Empire to spread her influence. South America, Africa, Siberia, the Mediterranean, and West Asia all made lucrative targets in the eyes of Japan's business firms. Soon, the influence of the shogun in the three-piece suit would make its way across the world, as her samurais wielding briefcases and MOUs knocked the doors of world capitals. But just as Japan began looking outside Asia, trouble would brew in the crown jewel of the co-prosperity sphere, trouble that may very well shake the sphere to its core.
In the southwestern frontiers of China lay the province of Yunnan. Mountainous, rugged, and underdeveloped in comparison to the urbanized centers of the north. The province had been ruled by the adventurous turncoat, Lu Han. A staunch pragmatist, Lu Han had reigned over the province as a hardline developmentalist, ever loyal to the dictates of Nanjing. A true king of the southwest, he had allowed large volumes of Japanese capital to flow into the province, erecting mines, workshops, and factories in a place that had only once been home to subsistence farmers. The Inspector General believed he was doing all this for the prosperity of China. The life of the average Yunnanese laborer only proved the exact opposite. The workers, miners, peasants, and craftsmen of the region worked excruciatingly long hours, with little pay and compensation. In contrast, Japanese businessmen sent from Tokyo and Guangdong to Yunnan lived in the luxury of their profits. The state of affairs had continued without much resistance from the people. Lu Han believed that just like he had, his countrymen understood that these conditions were the necessary suffering required for the country's modernization. Or so he thought. But not even a king of his stature could survive the coming tidal wave. Autumn 1965, Kunming. A professor of the regional university sets off into the southern hinterlands. In his hands contains a dossier from a Kunming officer. It's for the remnants of the Chinese Red Army. The armies once led by Chairman Mao Zedong were now but a mere shadow of their former selves. They had never given up their arms to the Japanese, hoping to strike back against them when the time was right. But their numbers were meager. The Kunming professor arrived at the Red Army jungle encampment, handing over the secret communique to the Red Army's commander. It reads, Long Yun extends his arms towards the comrades in the anti-Japanese resistance. The puzzled Red Army commander sees a glimpse of hope he has not seen in years. After a central committee meeting, the Red Army remnants accept Long Yun's offer. The professor makes his way back to Kunming, where the Red Army response was received by an officer of the Yunnanese army, who would hand the letter over to Long Yun. A cousin of Lu Han, Long Yun had once ruled Yunnan as governor, but China's defeat in the Second Sino-Japanese War had forced the ex-governor to resign from his position in favor of his more amicable cousin. Since then, Long Yun occupied the position of vice-governor, a mostly ceremonial position which held prestige and legitimacy, but little in terms of legal power. He could do little from his position as he watched his cousin sell off the province to Nanjing and Japanese businessmen. Long Yun was displeased, and he knew something had to be done. Behind closed doors, Long Yun's subordinates privately discussed plans for an insurrection in the southwest. Like-minded officers within the Yunnanese provincial army were enticed by the plot, flocking to the ranks in droves. It seemed that many within the army shared the sentiments of the conspiracists. With their ranks swelling by the day, the words National Protection Army began whispering in the streets of Yunnan cities and countryside. Rumors of the potential insurrection spread into the workshops, mines, and plantations, rumors which had inspired the overworked people
into a state of disorganized disobedience. The plot had caught the interest of the vice governor, Long Yun himself, who agreed to join the conspiracy against Luhan. Long's high-profile status and experience in Yunnanese provincial politics quickly earned him leadership over the movement. While Long Yun organized the disloyal elements of Luhan's army from the inside, comrades from around the province would assist in bringing a broad coalition of patriots into the alliance. Calls were made to the remnant armies of the United Front, the KMT's NRA and the CPC's Red Army, to join up with what would be called the National Protection Alliance. Frequent communication with the exile armies occurred consistently until finally the plans for the insurrection were complete. On New Year's Eve 1966, Long Yun finalized the plans for the coup. It was now do or die. In the first week of January 1966, Inspector General Luhan left the regional capital of Kunming to enjoy his vacation. The year had gone smoothly, with little in the way of scandals. Many business deals were signed during the year by the general, deals which would allow for more investment into his beloved province. His economic projections pointed out to a steady growth. The general believed all this was the result of his hard work. As the plane lifted off the tarmac, he thought of the beloved home province he was leaving behind. A quick vacation in Wuhan to celebrate his victories, and he'd be back to work in his office in Kunming. What could go wrong? Upon returning from his vacation, the general had sensed nothing out of the ordinary, a far cry from the truth. Upon opening his office door, General Luhan was greeted by the barrel of a gun. No, 7 guns. Army officers loyal to the National Protection Alliance had found their way into his office and were now aiming their firearms towards the Inspector General's head, but protest this act of intimidation by his subordinates. Upon questioning the motives of these insurrectionary officers, the Inspector General's cousin, Long Yun, emerged from behind. Luhan realized the gravity of the situation. There was no other way around it. It was his own cousin who had orchestrated this fiasco. The 7 officers quickly escorted Luhan out of the office and into a motorcade. He was to be held in custody until further notice. Long Yun made his way towards the seat he once held for 9 years. The true king of the Southwest had returned to his place. Across the province, formations of the NRA and the Red Army descended from their bases in south and eastern Yunnan, breaking through the outposts loyal to Luhan. The 2 armies converged towards Kunming, where they linked up with their comrades in the reconstituted NPA. The 3 forces began their preparations for an eastern expedition. There was little time to waste. News of the insurrection quickly traveled across the provinces, soon finding its way to the office of Republic President Gao Zongwu. Nanjing, mid-January 1966. It had been a week since Long Yun and the National Protection Army overthrew Inspector General Luhan from office, and President Gao Zongwu had failed to release an official statement. The situation was grim, and the cabinet was in a scramble. Nobody knew how to respond. There was no line of communications. The National Protection Army did not intend to negotiate. It was a region-wide insurrection. Gao Zongwu feared the rebellion would quickly spread across Yunnan's neighboring provinces. After all, who would want to live forever as a puppet of the Japanese? The insurrection would need to be crushed through military force. Gao made the calls to the Nanjing NRA's chief of staff. He ordered a total mobilization of the secret army. In Tokyo, the foreign ministry briefed Prime Minister Kaya on the matter. They told him that the insurrection in Yunnan was nothing to worry about. The backwater province could not burn the jewel of the co-prosperity sphere, he said, but the possibility of conflict enticed those within the Imperial Japanese Army. War could finally justify a high military budget, and if need be, Yunnan could be turned into a testing ground for new weapons. Prime Minister Kaya took the advice of the foreign ministry. Tokyo would observe the situation closely. The empire had more important matters to attend to. Italy was joining the co-prosperity sphere. A brief detour from the developments in China. The Japanese Foreign Ministry had been busying itself with an Italo-Japanese diplomatic arrangement. Italy had always held a precarious geopolitical position since the Italo-German split of the 1950s, and heavily relied on defense diplomacy to deter her northern neighbor, the Reich, from considering an invasion. The Mediterranean triumvirate once played the role of deterring German aggression, but a diplomatic incident between Turkey and Italy in 1962 regarding the Levant had shattered the alliance. Alone once more, Italian Prime Minister Giorgio Almirante began looking outside of the European continent for new potential allies. The Italian Prime Minister found himself a willing partner in the form of Japan's Prime Minister. After fully securing Japan's place in Greater Asia, Prime Minister Kaya Okinori had begun looking towards expanding Japan's reach to the rest of the world. He had already made a breach in Africa with the Malagasy Republic, but greater expansions were always possible. The Italian deal would secure a European bridgehead for the Japanese, and so Almirante and the Japanese ambassador in Rome intensely discussed the terms of the deal. Several weeks of negotiations came to fruition on November 30th, 1965. The Kingdom of Italy would join the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Rome was now subject to the defensive alliance of the Co-Prosperity Sphere, allowing the sphere to aid Rome in a defensive war. Conversely, Rome was now obligated to assist any Co-Prosperity Sphere member if they were attacked. Membership in the sphere also stipulated a new trade agreement between Italy and Greater Asia, trade which both parties desperately needed. The collapse of the triumvirate had shattered Italy's economic stability, which heavily relied on loosened trade barriers between the Mediterranean states. With their economies in stagnation, the Italian Prime Minister decided limited integration within the Co-Prosperity Sphere market would be preferable. The Japanese negotiators were delighted to hear this. It had been the Kaya cabinet's goal to expand Japan's economic interests in Europe. Through the securing of Italy's membership into the sphere, Japan inched ever closer to gaining a solid foothold on the European continent. A necessary move by Japan, because Germany had just recently deployed missiles in the Indian Ocean, and so the merchant marine made its way from Asian ports, headed towards the Mediterranean. Japan's men of business had begun opening headquarters in Italy and her West Asian colonies. Just as quick as the trade convoys, soldiers of the sphere nations began disembarking on the ports of Eritrea, tasked for a policing action to restore Italy's African colonies. But just as the sphere expanded its horizons, the insurrection in southwest China exploded. Chongqing, Sichuan, April 30th, 1966. News of the National Protection Alliance was spreading like wildfire across the province, igniting a wave of popular unrest in the streets. The Sichuanese officer corps had not anticipated such a thing, and they quickly lost control over the situation. Then suddenly, the governor was approached by men wearing the red and black bands of the National Protection Army, the red sun over the black sky. He had come from Kunming to hand over a message. It came directly from Long Yun himself, the renegade vice-governor. The letter urged the Sichuanese governor to side with the true sons of China or perish under her might. He glanced towards the window of his office, where he saw men waving banners of the National Protection Alliance. There was really no going back. The mood in the streets had decidedly moved towards Long Yun's rebellion. Taking a deep sigh, the governor reluctantly signed the agreement. The National Protection Alliance was growing by the day. Long Yun had not been sitting idly by throughout all this. He had been organizing for the coming war. The National Protection Army had been steadily growing during this time, merging the command structures of the Yunanese Army, the NRA, and the Red Army. Men of fighting age were conscripted into this growing army, as droves of women, housewives, and daughters filled the vacancies in the workplace. Prisoners, both petty and national traitors, were forced into penal battalions. The provincial bureaucracy too was reorganized, its membership purged of traitorous elements and replaced by the unemployed literati, prepared to expand the alliance's administrative reach upon entering neighboring provinces. The National Protection Alliance was ready for war. Guizhou Province, June 10th, 1966. An officer of the NPA hunkers down in the forest together with his men, the darkness of the night only brightened by the campfire. The battalion had been deployed in the forest for the coming battle against Nanjing. It was an inevitable conflict. The men all knew it. Those traitors in the north had become complacent with Japanese capital that they no longer saw the plight of their fellow countrymen. And so these men awaited their orders. The orders to strike out and enter enemy territories. The order came as the hour struck 12. All across the front, officers received the radio message from Kunming: "Dare to die." The NPA officer led his men towards a small military outpost at the Hunan border. The Nanjing NRA had not expected a night raid, most of their soldiers asleep at this hour. Those who were awake, the night watch, were too late to warn their comrades of the impending attack. The attackers threw their grenades into the enemy base, awakening them from their sleep. By the time that they had awoken, the entire outpost had been overrun by the NPA. The captured NRA soldiers could only accept their fates with resignation. All across the border, in Hunan and Hubei, NPA formations ambushed the beleaguered NRA, but soon, morning struck. The next wave of NPA attacks faced more formidable resistance from the NRA, who had prepared for the impending attack, but it was not enough to hold back the armies of Long Yun. July 12, 1966. The NPA forces marched on into the territory of the Nanjing government, their summer offensive concentrating its attack towards the city of Changde, an important supply hub for the NRA. The Battle of Changde was quick and decisive. The NRA, unable to find their footing, quickly lost the city to the charging Alliance army. The loss of Changde signaled to the warlords of China that the winds were changing. First, the NRA 24th Army in Xikang abandoned their neutrality in favor of the National Protection Alliance, followed by Guangxi on the 31st of July and Shaanxi on August 9th. These defections bolstered the military strength of the movement, as well as its legitimacy over China. Soon, the combined armies of the South and Northwest began closing in around Gaozongwu. The following months after Shaanxi's defection were an unmitigated disaster for Gao's Nanjing government. Reports of military defeats flooded his presidential palace, first Nanchang, falling to the National Protection Alliance in early September, then Wuhan a week after. Reports of the defeats were kept hidden from the public so as to not arouse opposition in the streets. President Gao had practically issued a state of martial law in the provinces under his control, suspending civil liberties for an indefinite amount of time. President Gao did not want his benefactors in the business community to withdraw investments out of fear from the insurrection. This included hiding the insurrection from his closest contacts within the Japanese Empire, who were completely blindsided from the developments in China. When Japanese intelligence discovered just how dire the situation had become, Prime Minister Kaya had decided to leave Gaozongwu to the wolves. Nanjing, December 7th, 1966. The National Protection Army was on the doorsteps of Nanjing, capital of the Republic of China. President Gaozongwu had barricaded himself in his office, despite the pleadings of his subordinates to flee. The portraits of Wang Jingwei and Sun Yat-sen were hanging above the president's head, judging him from the afterlife. In the distance, sounds of artillery fire echoed across the sky, indicators that the National Protection Alliance was close by. So close, in fact, that the gunfight had already spread to the surrounding palace grounds. One by one, sections of the palace were taken over by Long Yun's men, and one by one, the NRA forces defending the sectors abandoned their posts, defecting to the NPA in droves. Before long, the NPA had reached Gao's office. But when they reached into the office, all they found was his dead body, pistol in hand, the blood staining the two portraits which hung above. The king of the Hanjians was dead. Even before Gao's corpse had gone cold, the Japanese finally made their move. Swooping from Manchuria, elements of the Imperial Japanese Army were airlifted to Beijing. deployed to the front lines with the National Protection Alliance. The Japanese had reached out to Generalissimo Long for a ceasefire and peace negotiations to ensure the common prosperity of Greater Asia. Kaya Okinori had banked on Long Yun's sensibilities as a statesman to avoid a prolonged war between Asian brothers. But Long Yun knew that any negotiation would result in the resubjugation of China by the Japanese. He did not wish to become another Gao Zhongwu. China's liberation could only be brought through a people's resistance, and so the National Protection Alliance responded to Japan's offer with a resounding no. China and Japan quickly tumbled themselves into a conflict which would redefine the Asian continent forever. The Great Asian War had begun. December 16th, 1966. Tokyo formally declares war against Long Yun and the National Protection Alliance. The Imperial Japanese Army crosses into the border, engaging with Long Yun's armies across the country. The men of the Southwest were now coming face to face with the world's preeminent superpower and her modern army. It became immediately clear that in a conventional war, the NPA's armies were severely outmatched. The IJA held the upper hand in firepower, tactics, air power, and maneuverability, but the NPA held the home advantage. They knew the terrain and had the full support of the people. The war will take sacrifices to win. Both sides understood this. Upon Japan's declaration of war, the formerly neutral provinces of Xinjiang and Gansu immediately declared their support for the National Protection Alliance on December 16, 1966. Border skirmishes occurred all across the front as soon as hostilities broke out. But in Beijing, where the invading Japanese army had set up headquarters, plans were being drawn up for a northern offensive. But while preparations for this offensive were being made, the NPA took the initiative. On February 2, 1967, the National Protection Army would launch an invasion of Mongolia, Tibet, and Guangdong. Mongolia and Guangdong mounted an effective defense, keeping the NPA at bay. Tibet, on the other hand, was not so lucky. The overwhelming force of the NPA invasion would break the Tibetan defense within 2 months, forcing their surrender on April 2, 1967. Simultaneously, the Japanese would launch their own offensive from their positions in the Hebei-Shandong front. The Japanese armored columns tore through the front line, accompanied on their flanks by armored personnel carriers and covered by heavy artillery fire. The NPA had met their match in the form of the Imperial Japanese Army. Their weapons outdated and antiquated, soldiers of the NPA faced an uphill battle fighting their Japanese adversaries. From early January, towns and villages in the Central Plains were overrun by the oncoming Japanese advance. By March, half of Henan, Anhui, and Jiangsu were under Japanese occupation. The authority of the puppet Beijing emergency government was reasserted in these regions, and agitators of the NPA were rounded up by the Japanese authorities. If the situation was not handled delicately, the entire front might collapse in an instant. Guangdong, March 19, 1967. Large columns of IJA trucks, tanks, and APCs lined up across the Silicon Delta. Heavy troop buildup had been taking place across Guangdong for some time now. With the success of the Hebei-Shandong front, the IJA General Staff had wished to replicate it in the south. The plan was a northwards push from Guangdong straight to Wuhan. When the Northern Army crossed the Yellow River on the 1st of April, the Guangdong Army made its move. Immediately, the mobile divisions tore through the NPA's Southern Army with speed, forcing a total rout.
The two armies eventually converged on the river city of Wuhan. The IJA's southern and northern armies' encirclement had cut off the entire NPA Eastern Army from the rest of China. The situation had turned dire for the NPA. Inside NPA High Command, a plan to rescue the NPA Eastern Army was formulated. A total breakdown at the Silicon Delta would need to be attempted. It was a dangerous gambit. Guangzhou would surely be heavily defended, several generals believed. Reconnaissance had proved otherwise. The Japanese Southern Army was stretched thin across the Guangzhou-Nanchang line, and so, under duress, Long Yun ordered a counterattack towards Guangzhou on the 29th of April, 1967. Heavy fighting immediately occurred all across the districts of the Silicon City as the NPA forced its way into the city. By June 6th, the urban center would fall to the NPA's hands. Upon falling into their hands, reprisals were enacted by the Chinese populace against the Japanese and half-Japanese populations who had failed to flee. Blood soon stained the Pearl River Delta. The securing of Guangzhou had saved the NPA Eastern Army from total destruction. But the Battle of Guangzhou did not come without its strategic costs. As a result of the battle, the city of Nanjing and the provinces of Shaanxi, Hunan, Anhui, and Jiangsu had been allowed to fall under Japanese control. But by July 23rd, the Japanese offensive would run out of steam. They had overextended their forces and were now forced to contend with an enlarging rearguard. Outside of the vortex that is the Great Asian War, major developments were occurring all across the world in quick succession, as 1967 turned out to be a pivotal year for the Cold War. On April 25th, a military coup in Turkey led by General Alparslan Türkeş overthrew the democratically elected DYP government. Tokyo had yet to comment on the events. Then on May 8, 1967, the National Progressive Party won the Laotian legislative elections. The National Progressive Party holds a staunchly pro-Japanese foreign policy, which puts the nation ever closer with the co-prosperity sphere. Then in Europe, 3 months later, on August 12, 1967, the French state entered a state of civil war after resistance to President Sidos devolved into open revolt. Various factions rose up against the Vichy government, from the French resistance to the far left, but in the end, the Catholic corporatist Georges Sauget won as a result of his alliance with Rome. Following the victory, the French state entered a new alliance with Italy and Japan, bringing it under the umbrella of the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Meanwhile, in Copenhagen on August 25, 1967, diplomats from Washington and Germania met to negotiate a cooling off of hostilities, resulting in a détente between the two superpowers. The world had reached a new phase in the Cold War, the phase of détente. But while peace had become the order of the day around the world, the war in China was about to enter a new and bloodier phase. On August 26, 1967, the Japanese army launched yet another deadly offensive, this time targeting Hunan and Guangxi, another attempt to encircle the NPA Eastern Army. The IJA offensive struck hard against the NPA Center Army, striking them from land and air. The attack began with an aerial bombardment of the NPA's defensive positions. Watchtowers, machine gun nests, and entire fortresses were damaged by the initial strafing. Then followed the tanks and APCs, sweeping up what little resistance remained. The NPA retreated from their positions, safely guarding manpower and avoiding too many casualties against their technologically superior foe. They ran for the forests and mountains, regrouping for the next counterattack as Japan swept through the two provinces. By November, they had successfully occupied Guangxi and reaching the border with Vietnam. The NPA Eastern Army was encircled once more by the Japanese, but to the dismay of the IJA High Command, the encircled NPA lived on. A more effective supply network had been built across the eastern provinces, courtesy of the NPA's bureaucracy. And so even as Shanghai fell to the Japanese in December 1967, the Eastern Army huddled in the mountains of Jiangxi and Fujian, preparing themselves when the call for a truly great offensive came. In Kunming, Generalissimo Long Yun and his general staff had been adapting to Japan's tactics and technological superiority. The NPA's engineers were able to get their hands on Japanese equipment, captured by the army on the battlefield and by fifth columnists behind enemy lines. By New Year's 1968, the NPA was equipping its soldiers with more effective small arms, anti-tank rockets, and man-portable air defense systems. The NPA's total mobilization of the Chinese economy had thus allowed the replication and the production of these newly acquired weapons, refitting a great 40% of the army by the start of January 1968.
just in time for the NPA's Great Northern Expedition. From his capital city of Kunming, Generalissimo Long Yun announced to the Chinese nation a great final offensive to drive the Japanese invaders out. He called on the Chinese people to support the soldiers and patriotic saboteurs fighting hard in the war. The people heeded his calls as they flooded the streets of NPA-controlled China in support of the war effort. On the front lines, the soldiers of the Protection Army made their move. They attacked Japanese military positions across Hunan and Guangxi province. The IJA were overwhelmed by the sheer amount of men deployed by the NPA, who were now equipped with modern equipment. By April, the NPA had captured a sizable amount of Hunan. Japanese supply depots were now subject to a renewed campaign of sabotage from behind. The offensive was picking up steam. After successfully probing the Japanese defenses, the NPA was prepared to unleash their full strength. Long Yun's men attacked from 3 points: Hunan, Sichuan, and Zhejiang. Throughout the summer of 1968, the NPA center would encircle the Japanese army in Guangxi, while the NPA Eastern Army drove Japan out of Zhejiang. Japan retaliated with a brutal bombing campaign in Hunan in an attempt to break out the encircled army. The campaign had ended the relentless assault on Japanese positions in the province, but would do little to salvage Japan's strategic conundrum in the east. After the fall of Zhejiang, the NPA marched further north towards Jiangsu. By October 1968, the armies of Long Yun were at the outskirts of Nanjing. The great southern capital fell to the NPA on October 16, 1968, after a swift battle. The fall of Nanjing intensified the battle for Hunan, as NPA troops from the Eastern Front were redeployed to the center. For 3 months, both sides fought ferociously for control over Hunan, but neither could break the deadlock. In Jiangsu, Japan launched a counterattack to recapture Nanjing, encircling the city and its last defenders. By now, New Year's 1969 had set in, and the NPA offensive was still intensifying all across the front. To break the Hunanese deadlock, the NPA strategically redeployed their Western Army once fighting hard against Japan in Xinjiang towards the province. The Western Army's redeployment was what the NPA needed to turn the tide of battle in their favor. By January 25, 1969, the Japanese Center Army faced a total rout in Hunan, retreating what men they could north of the Yangtze. The NPA offensive was picking up steam. By February, the NPA Center Army and the Eastern Army merged into one front. The two armies converged on the city of Wuhan, capturing it by April that year. They now prepared for a grand offensive across the Central Plains. The NPA summer offensive began on May 20, 1969, as the two armies battled across the Central Plains. Hubei province fell to the NPA in July 1969, followed by an encirclement of the Japanese Shaanxi garrison in Xi'an. On the 7th of July, Nanjing was recaptured by the NPA as they dislodged the Japanese army's positions in the city. The encirclement of Xi'an ended with the surrender of the Japanese Shaanxi garrison. Meanwhile, in the Central Plains, the NPA had swept across the region as they entered the towns and villages of Henan province. By late August 1969, the NPA was poised to retake Shandong, Beijing, and Hebei. The Imperial Japanese Army watched on in horror as the National Protection Alliance swept across China. The Kaya cabinet was quickly losing faith in the army's ability to suppress the NPA. A new strategy would need to be deployed. The Imperial Japanese Navy, arch nemesis to the IJA, suggested a different line of attack. They proposed a renewed offensive from the south through the recapture of Guangdong. The goal of this attack was both militarily strategic and economic. Guangdong was one of China's richest provinces and had become an important part of the NPA's productive base. The economists within the cabinet too argued that the NPA was fighting on borrowed time and limited money. They could not continue financing this war, the ministers argued. In comparison, Japan had mostly kept their finances afloat through the surplus trade gained through the European market's opening. This of course did not mean Japan's finances were safe. The spiraling war in China had turned into a financial sinkhole for the Japanese state, a sinkhole which many within the army were all too happy to benefit from. But the Japanese economists were correct. The NPA had drowned in much debt and could not solely rely on the liberation of new provinces to save their finances. The war had caused much destruction for China's urban industrial base. which forced manufacturing to turn towards small local workshops to avoid Japanese strategic bombing. In the countryside, manpower had been drained as farmers and peasants turned into soldiers under the NPA's conscription laws. The drained rural workforce severely diminished agricultural output in NPA territories. The economic strain on the NPA was starting to show when their armies bogged down in Hebei. On September 27, 1969, Japan finally launched their response to the Great Northern Expedition. The offensive operations began with an incursion out of Guangdong, through a bridgehead made earlier in the summer offensive. Through September and October, the Imperial Japanese Navy land forces battled the NPA across Guangdong and Guangxi with the support of offshore missile cruisers. While combat intensified in the south, the IJA struck back hard in the north, driving the NPA back into the Central Plains. By October, the NPA Center Army had their backs against the Yangtze, and once more, Nanjing was under threat. Back in the south, the IJN land forces had driven the NPA out of Liangguang and were now ordered to link up with the IJA, who had been receiving success after success in November. Hebei, Shaanxi, and Jiangsu were now under Japanese control thanks to the IJA. The city of Nanjing fell on the 29th of November, followed by Hunan. The fall of Hunan finally linked up the IJA with the IJN land forces and cutting off the NPA Eastern Army in Fujian by December. By now, the NPA Eastern Army was a shadow of its former self, defeated in battle and demoralized from their encirclement. It fought on with 30% of its combat strength. Throughout December, the IJA launched an encirclement campaign to eliminate the encircled divisions, which was successfully completed by December 29th. Further westwards, the IJA had begun occupying Yunnan itself, threatening the province from the north and the east. Kunming, the capital city of the National Protection Alliance, became subject to indiscriminate aerial bombardments. The Generalissimo retreated from his capital when Japanese armored columns entered the city. He would continue fighting to the bitter end, retreating to Xikang and later NPA occupied Tibet. By January 1970, all that remained of the NPA were pockets of resistance based in the Himalayas. Leaders, bureaucrats, agitators, and organizers of the NPA, stuck in Japanese-controlled territory, found themselves imprisoned and summarily executed as enemies of Greater Asia. Survivors could only hope for the best, retreating and reorganizing in the Himalayas for the next opportunity. But the NPA's final retreat was not to be. The Japanese army quickly followed the Being Chinese armies into Tibet. A final battle occurred, which resulted in a complete annihilation of the NPA as its leaders, including the Generalissimo, fought to the bitter end against the Japanese. The tattered remains of the Generalissimo's uniforms were then found in the battlefield. The NPA had finally been defeated. The Japanese imperial sun had once more eclipsed China's revolutionary star in this great Asian war. With the political order in China completely shattered, the task fell to the Japanese Empire to redraw the administrative borders of China. With the consultation of their new puppets, Zhang Renli, former finance minister under Gao Zhongwu's cabinet, became the new president of a reorganized Republic of China. China was carved up among several autonomous regions that answered directly to Tokyo. The North China Political Council, the Southwest China Political Council, and the two Japanese-led military regions in Gansu and Sichuan. The state of Guangdong of Ibuka Masaru, together with Tibet, had their sovereignties reestablished by the occupying Japanese army. The new status quo, which emerged at the dusk of the Great Asian War in March 1970, would ensure that China would not eclipse Japan for decades, if centuries to come. The pacification of China finally secured Japan's total hold over Asia. The bridgehead in Europe, built by Italy and France's entry into the co-prosperity sphere, ensured that Japanese economic influence would not be disrupted by the war. Europe continued to be a large importer of Asian goods, including Bengali textiles and Japanese electronics. When Reichsfuhrer Albert Speer signed a détente with Japan, the resulting deal too would boost Japan's exports, while cooling relations between the two powers. But the turn of the decade also saw renewed instability in West Asia, beginning with a Republican revolt in Yemen on October 12, 1970. a revolt which quickly spiraled into total regional collapse. A resurgent Arab nationalist movement had erupted out of the Italian satellite states of West Asia, including Egypt, Yemen, Oman, and Iraq. The instability would shatter global oil supplies as Italian-run refineries in West Asia suddenly became targets for the revolutionaries. World economies faced the brunt of this oil shortage, followed by political instability in these nations. To quell the situation, and utilizing the terms of the Co-Prosperity Sphere's defensive alliance, Italy called on her Japanese allies to assist with the pacification of West Asia. Together, Rome and Tokyo swept the nationalist revolutionaries back into hiding, securing once more Rome's control over the region. The shocks to global oil supply would also have political consequences to the world. 2 months after the West Asian oil wars, oil riots would erupt in the Southeast Asian nation of Thailand. The ensuing political crisis would see Thai President Chatichai Chunhavan negotiating with the rioters, reshuffling his cabinet in favor of loyal ministers, and dissolving the Khana Ratsadon. In place of the Ratsadon, he created a new party, the paternalistic National Development Party, as his personal political vessel. Now limiting itself to the periphery of the sphere, similar oil riots would erupt in the state of Guangdong. Long-simmering ethnic tensions that had been building up since the defeat of the NPA suddenly broke out on October 20th, 1971, forcing Chief Executive Masaru to declare martial law. 7 months of intense negotiations and crackdowns would eventually quell the riots, defending the corporatocratic state from further assaults, and securing Masaru's position as Guangdong's chief executive. On September 24, 1971, the veteran Prime Minister of Japan, Kaya Okinori, would resign his position in favor of his successor, Fukuda Takeo. Having aged during his tenure as Prime Minister, Kaya no longer deemed himself in good health to manage the Japanese state. His successor won a resounding victory at the national elections, securing a continuation of the managerial developmentalist project which Kaya laid out. Prime Minister Fukuda was immediately dealt with a political crisis in Iran, which he successfully maneuvered by supporting the insurrectionary government of Khomeini. From the 1970s onwards, Japan's foreign policy would take a sharp westward turn in an effort to enforce West Asia's political stability and avoid another oil crisis. And so when on May 25, 1972, the Central Asian nations began negotiations for unification, the Japanese Foreign Office immediately took towards disrupting its success. Together with the Republic of Afghanistan, efforts were made to sabotage Central Asia. High-profile assassinations and large attacks on public infrastructure, committed by Tokyo and Kabul-funded proxies, had reached its intended result, plunging the entire region into anarchy by preventing the formation of a state that may challenge Japanese dominance over West Asia. Further up north in Russia, a unified Russian state had emerged from the Smuta, led by President Alexander Pokrishkin, the Falcon of Novosibirsk. From the mid-1960s, the Novosibirsk state had relied on cooperation with Japanese zaibatsus for their bid to reunify Russia. This bid paid off on August 16, 1971, when the Siberian Federation defeated the USSR in the 1971 Russian Civil War. After proclaiming the formation of the Russian Federation President Alexander Pokrishkin announced Russia's entry into the Greater Asian Customs Union. Upon Russia's entry into the Asian market, the Big Five zaibatsus of Japan made their way into the Russian mining industry. They quickly became large players inside Russia's business environment. Meanwhile, in the United States, a growing sense of disappointment had developed among the general public by 1972. The American populace had once placed their hopes for reform on Robert Kennedy, elected in the 1964 election. But when President Kennedy's reforms fell short, he had relied on a renewed effort to wage proxy wars across the globe in an attempt to re-enter the old world. Even these wars failed to save his presidency, only serving to tie up the United States in a string of endless wars in West Africa, France, and Colombia. And so when a referendum on Kennedy's presidency came to the ballot box, his party was resoundingly defeated by the Republican Barry Goldwater. Under the Goldwater presidency, cuts to welfare spending were made to balance the budget, which had fallen into the red by Kennedy's foreign debacles. But this did little to sway the populace towards the Democrats and Republicans. When the election of 1972 rolled around, incumbent President Barry Goldwater would be faced with a total electoral defeat at the hands of Francis Parker Yockey and the NPP sovereignists. President Yockey's victory signaled a severe blow to American liberalism as the outwardly fascist president moved towards dismantling civil rights and the OFN security state. While America's domestic situation deteriorated with the destruction of civil rights, strides were made by the president to tie in German-American relations, a development which Japan saw as potentially threatening. The Reich itself fared no better than her Atlantic neighbors. The reformist Führer Albert Speer had failed to re-establish Germany's presence in Africa, while his half-hearted economic reforms did too little too late to promote economic equality in Central Europe. Fissures had also begun to grow within Speer's own cabinet, with reform-minded ministers wishing he had gone further and hardliners bemoaning how liberal he had become. On October 14, 1971, the internal crisis in the cabinet would burst into the seams when a slave revolt erupted in German-occupied Eastern Europe. Hardliner Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner moved quickly to seize control over the Moscovian RC to turn it into his personal fiefdom. From his position in Moscow, the Field Marshal personally crushed the Eastern European slave revolt, successfully subduing the rebellion by November 14, 1972. Meanwhile, an internal party coup by Theodor Oberlander dislodged Führer Speer's position in the party, effectively turning the Führer into a puppet of President Oberlander. By 1973, Japan's former enemies in the Cold War had found themselves in significant decline and complete political disintegration. The rigid political systems which once opposed Japan on the world stage had imploded as a result of failed economic and foreign policy. One by one, these rivaling systems fell. In Germania, strongman dictatorship had dissolved into a system of collective party leadership, overseeing an empire which had failed to adjust to the atomic age. Then in the United States, the bourgeois liberal system had been slow to respond to growing social tensions, only able to offer the most moderate and watered reforms. Unable to address their issues, the democratic system had ended up voting for a man that would revoke the rights of everyone. But as Washington and Germania's prestige fell, Japan's sun rose ever higher. The rising sun had become a true global economic center, effectively accepting their position as the workshop of the world. Japanese goods flooded the world, outcompeting the domestic competition of all other nations. Italy, Russia, Arabia, Germany, America, Iberia, South America, and Africa all became consumers to Japan's products. To protect the flow of trade, the Japanese Empire constructed naval stations, military bases, and aligned with local armies to ensure the flow of profits. This objectively turned Japan into the gendarme of the world. Very few could contest the fact that the Japanese Empire had become the sole hegemon of the world. And that is how Japan won the Cold War.
Special thanks to the patrons Arthur, Ascension of the Andes, SMS Bismarck, Retrocity, Yannick Bar, and the Youth League members on screen for supporting the channel. If you want to support the channel like they do and earn special perks while you're at it, feel free to subscribe to the Patreon, link in the description.